Will Warhammer The Old World replace Age of Sigmar? No. No, it won't. So that's probably a YouTube no-no, and a little bit strange to put the conclusion of the video right at the start, but I just wanted to make it clear right from the off that really Warhammer The Old World will not replace Age of Sigmar. I don't think that's Games Workshop's intent, and I don't think that's the goal for what The Old World needs to do to be successful. So let me explain. So let's start with why this question may even be asked, even though I personally wouldn't ask it myself. On the face of it, to people who maybe don't really know, it seems like a reasonable question. Warhammer Fantasy existed, it got squatted and replaced with Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and now Fantasy is coming back with a bit of a rebrand, so you might think, well, maybe it's time for Age of Sigmar to say bye-bye. And that's not really the case. This is not a tacit admission from Games Workshop that they were wrong to get rid of Fantasy, and that somehow Age of Sigmar is a failure. That's really not what they're saying. That's not the case here. I think it's basically Games Workshop trying to have their cake and eat it as well. Now, this is a little bit difficult to prove, but basically it's thought of in the community that effectively Warhammer Age of Sigmar is far more popular than Warhammer Fantasy ever was. And as much as that pains me as a ex-Fantasy player, I can sort of understand it. But Age of Sigmar seems to have closed the gap between itself and say like 40k, whereas Fantasy was maybe sliding down the pecking order. It was maybe becoming less and less popular. So Games Workshop stepped in, end-timed Fantasy, and replaced it with Age of Sigmar. And really, Age of Sigmar has been nothing but successful for Games Workshop, I think in almost all areas except one. I mean, we can sit here and we can maybe argue about the stats and figures and try and determine its popularity. I tried to look on Google Trends to prove this, but quite frankly, that all the search terms are in different categories and I couldn't really make anything make sense. Even if I did, it's not really a fair comparison anyway. But the people who are sort of in the industry and that people I spoke to who know these things, they tell me generally that Age of Sigmar is far more popular than Fantasy ever was. And I can believe that. I think quite simply the game rules are a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more friendly to the people who want to play them. Partly, I think, because 40k players, if they don't like 40k aesthetic, they can now play Age of Sigmar, and it's a game that sort of visually looks the same in the fact that it's a skirmish game. Well, and you also have Space Marines and the Golden Boy Space Marines, basically, for Sigmar. I think a skirmish game is just generally more appealing to more people than, say, a rank and file game, and the rules may have been better. Maybe not at first, because there was the issue about like not even having points and stuff like that, but in the long run, Age of Sigmar may have like a more consistent rule set than what Fantasy ever did. So all I'm saying there is that there's reasons to think Age of Sigmar is more popular, and let's just take it for red that it is. Like, let's just presume that it is for the argument's sake. If you want to disagree with that, I would love to see your evidence, but all signs indicate that Age of Sigmar is just more popular, right? So Age of Sigmar would not get replaced with Warhammer Fantasy or the Old World. It just would not make sense. If that is the case, the question obviously that begs to be asked is, why are Games Workshop even bringing back Warhammer Fantasy even under the rebrand as the Old World? And for the answer to that question, I think things go a little bit deeper. If they're not doing it directly for a miniatures game popularity, then what are they doing it for? They are, after all, a miniatures company, right? Sort of. So there's a few reasons that I felt like they were bringing back the Old World. One of them I'm not sure is the right reason anymore, but maybe it was at the time, and that is games like A Song of Ice and Fire. That game was sort of quite popular for a couple of years before Games Workshop announced the Old World, and in my head I thought, oh, this makes sense. Games Workshop sort of want to compete with that, and they don't want that to sort of like eat into their market, so they're just going to fight against it and try and kill it off. But in the time that it was announced to the time that we are now, A Song of Ice and Fire is perhaps not quite as popular. I don't see it as much on the internet, and I don't see it as much in local communities and that kind of thing. I'm not calling the game dead, I'm just saying it's may not be as popular as it was several years ago, partly maybe because of the ending of the series, which most people agree was pretty crap. However, I think there's a new Game of Thrones thing coming out, and there's many projects down the line, so maybe that'll pick up again, and maybe Games Workshop reasoning would make sense if they thought, as I did, that they wanted to compete against it. Probably wasn't their main reason. And that's what leads me on to the big one, and that is IP, intellectual property. And the IP for me is generally where I think Age of Sigmar has failed. Yes, Games Workshop can trademark the Age of Sigmar stuff a bit easier because they've got like unique names like Oryx instead of Orcs and stuff like that, right? But what's actually important is that Games Workshop effectively sell their IP to other companies, and they just like having that money. Who wouldn't? Those other companies generally are making video games, but there's probably other stuff like maybe Wizards of the Coast with the Magic the Gathering stuff. Like, there's probably other ways that they're trying to sell their IP, but the video games are perhaps the most well known. Now, there have been some Age of Sigmar video games. However, I don't believe that they have really captured the video game market audience World as much as Games Workshop would have liked. And I think partly just simply because of the aesthetic. I don't think it necessarily resonates as well as fantasy does. However, maybe they've just not had a good game, and maybe they're still hopeful that it will start resonating with the video game community. But when we look at the fantasy style video games, well, there's been quite a few big hitters. The main two being Vermintide, which of course was very popular, and then the truly big one is Total War Warhammer, which I'm just going to start calling Total Warhammer because it just makes sense, right? The point is that Games Workshop can maintain a fantasy IP without supporting it quite as dramatically as they have to do with Age of Sigmar and 40k. It will effectively just fill a little bit of a niche while providing them a lot of benefit elsewhere. And personally, that niche is good for me. I don't necessarily want a game where all the rules are chopping and changing every other week with new models and new books and stuff like that. I'm getting too old for that. I don't play enough for that. So I'm quite happy to have a game that maybe where the release schedule is a little bit slower. So it's fitting a niche maybe for an audience like me, and I'm very happy about that. And obviously, I'm not asking every game to cater towards me, by the way. I don't think Age of Sigmar and 40k should listen to me. They should be like, well, Jay, he doesn't get to play that much, so we're just not going to release a new Space Marine Lieutenant this month. Like, no, they can do what they like. But when the game does cater to me, that's the game I'm going to try and play. And Games Workshop, with the help of Forge World, are obviously going to support fantasy or the old world. It's just not going to be as quick, I think. And as I said, the niche that it will fill is, well, they'll have a proper rank and file game, which is something they don't currently have as a supported game. And it's on square bases, which I know a lot of us old school players might actually enjoy. If the old world manages to win back some of the old fantasy crew, Games Workshop will be happy. Now, they're not going to win back all of the old crew because really some of those fans are going to be unwinnable back. They're just a little bit too annoyed and a little bit too salty, and I'm not going to blame them. That's fair enough. But if they can win some back and they can maybe get an audience that they wouldn't otherwise have got with their other games, Games Workshop are probably going to be happy. And really, I don't think the game has to be super profitable because it's all about that IP and how they're going to use it. They now have a chance to expand on the lore, which will help for games like Total Warhammer. We've already seen that with the Cafe. I don't actually know how you say that. I've only ever seen it written down. I've never seen it pronounced. But we've seen that they have implemented some of the drawings and the artwork for the old world into Total Warhammer. So they're already trying to do that. I would not be surprised if they are pushing that IP sales-wise to many other video game companies, being like, hey, we're going to launch this and it's already popular already, so you want to join in and you want to make games for it. And some people will, because the IP is well loved. I think the old world or fantasy Warhammer IP or the aesthetic is just a little bit easier for people to understand. They're already sort of familiar with similar IPs like Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff, because effectively they're all the same. I think it was Lord of the Rings first, then Warhammer, then Warcraft. I may have that the wrong order, but basically they all sort of feel a little bit similar with like their own little unique twists and stuff like that. But if you're a video game company and you want like a fantasy game, it's probably better to pick an existing IP because people will feel more familiar with it and it'll get more recognition. So that's what Games Workshop are banking on here. They're trying to have their cake and eat it as well. They're going to make a game that they're not going to support as heavily, and they're going to sell their IP for massive profits. And I'm going to reap the reward because that's the kind of game that I want. But no, Age of Sigmar is not getting replaced. I can understand why people might ask the question, because if you're not really that familiar with the games, you might think, yeah, it's coming back, it's replacing it. That's really not what they're trying to do here. But I just wanted to answer that sort of question because I think some people might ask it, and if you searched it for that reason, do let me know in the comments below. I'd be very curious. What I would like you to do is like and subscribe though if you did enjoy this video. Definitely though, have a most beautiful day. Bye-bye.